Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne, Chapter 24, during which Mr. Fogg and party crossed the Pacific Ocean. What happened when the pilot boat came in sight of Shanghai will be easily guessed. The signals made by the tankadere had been easily seen by the captain of the Yokohama steamer, who, espying the flag at half-mast, had directed his course towards the little craft. Phileas Fogg, after paying the stipulated price of his passage to John Busby, and rewarding that worthy with an additional sum of £550, ascended the steamer with Aouda and Fix, and they started at once for Nagasaki and Yokohama. They reached their destination on the morning of the 14th of November. Phileas Fogg lost no time in going on board the Carnatic when he learned, to Ada's great delight, and perhaps his own, though he betrayed no emotion, that Passepartout, a Frenchman, had really arrived on her the day before. The San Francisco steamer was announced to leave that very evening, and it became necessary to find Passepartout, if possible, without delay. Mr. Fogg applied in vain to the French and English consuls, and after wandering through the streets a long time, began to despair of finding his missing servant. Chance, or perhaps a kind presentiment, at last led him to the Honourable Mr. Battlecar's theatre. He certainly would not have recognized Passepartout in the eccentric mountebank's costume, but the latter, lying on his back, perceived his master in the gallery. He could not help starting, which so changed the position of his nose as to bring the pyramid pell-mell upon the stage. All this Passepartout learned from Aouda, who recounted to him what had taken place on the voyage from Hong Kong to Shanghai on the tankadere, in company with one Mr. Fix. Passepartout did not change countenance on hearing this name. He thought that the time had not yet arrived to divulge to his master what had taken place between the detective and himself, and, in the account he gave of his absence, he simply excused himself for having been overtaken by drunkenness and smoking opium at a tavern in Hong Kong. Mr. Fogg heard this narrative coldly without a word, then furnished his man with funds necessary to obtain clothing more in harmony with his position. Within an hour the Frenchman had cut off his nose and parted with his wings, and retained nothing about him which called his secretary of the god Tingo. The steamer, which was about to depart from Yokohama to San Francisco, belonged to the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, and was named General Grant. She was a large paddle-wheel steamer of 2,500 tons, and well-equipped and very fast. The massive walking beam rose and fell above the deck. At one end a piston rod worked up and down. At the other was a connecting rod which, in changing the rectilinear motion to a circular one, was directly connected with the shaft of the paddles. The General Grant was rigged with 3 masts, giving a large capacity for sails, and thus materially aiding the steam power. By making 12 miles an hour, she would cross the ocean in 21 days. Phileas Fogg was therefore justified in hoping that he would reach San Francisco by the 2nd of December, New York by the 11th, and London on the 20th, thus gaining several hours on the fatal day of the 21st of December. There was a full complement of passengers on board, among them English, many Americans, a large number of coolies on their way to California, and several East Indian officers who were spending their vacation in making the tour of the world. Nothing of moment happened in the voyage. The steamer, sustained on its large paddles, rolled but little, and the Pacific almost justified its name. Mr. Fogg was as calm and taciturn as ever. His young companion felt herself more and more attached to him by other ties than gratitude. His silent but generous nature impressed her more than she thought, and it was almost unconsciously that she yielded to emotions which did not seem to have the least effect upon her protector. Aouda took the keenest interest in his plans, and became impatient at any incident which seemed likely to retard his journey. She often chatted with Passepartout, who did not fail to perceive the state of his lady's heart, and, being the most faithful of domestics, he never exhausted his eulogies of Phileas Fogg's honesty, generosity, and devotion. He took pains to calm Aouda's doubts of a successful termination of the journey, telling her that the most difficult part of it had passed, and they were beyond the fantastic countries of Japan and China, and were fairly on their way to civilized places again. The railway train from San Francisco to New York and a transatlantic steamer from New York to Liverpool would doubtless bring them to the end of this impossible journey round the world within the period agreed upon. On the 9th day after leaving Yokohama, Phileas Fogg traversed exactly one-half the terrestrial globe. The General Grant passed, on the 23rd of November, the 180th meridian, and was at that very antipodes of London. Mr. Fogg, and it's true, exhausted 52 of the 80 days which he was to complete the tour, and there were only 28 left. But though he was only halfway to the difference of the meridians, he had really gone over 2/3 of the whole journey, for he had been obliged to take long circuits from London to Aden, from Aden to Bombay, from Calcutta to Singapore, and from Singapore to Yokohama. Could he have followed without deviation the 50th parallel, which is that of London, the whole distance would have only been about 12,000 miles. Whereas he would have been forced by the irregular methods of locomotion to traverse 26,000 of which he had on the 23rd of November, accomplished 17,500. And now the course was a straight one, and Fix no longer there to put the obstacles in their way. It happened also on the 23rd of November that Passepartout made a joyful discovery. It will be remembered that the obstinate fellow had insisted on keeping his famous family watch at London time, and on regarding that of countries he had passed through as quite false and unreliable. Now, on this day, though he had not changed the hands, he found that his watch exactly agreed with the ship's chronometers. His triumph was hilarious. Who would like to know what Fix would say if he were aboard? The rogue told me a lot of stories, repeated Passepartout, about the meridians, the sun, the moon. Moon, indeed. Moonshine, more likely. If one listened to that sort of people, a pretty sort of time would one keep. I was sure that the sun would someday regulate itself by my watch. Passepartout was ignorant that, if the face of his watch had been divided into 24 hours like the Italian clocks, he would have no reason for exultation. For the hands of his watch would then, instead, as of now, indicating 9 o'clock in the morning, indicate 9 o'clock in the evening, that is, the 21st hour after midnight, precisely the difference between London time and that of 180th meridian. But if Fix had been able to explain this purely physical effect, Passepartout would not have admitted, even if he had comprehended it. Moreover, if the detective had been on board at that moment, Passepartout would have joined issue with him on quite a different subject and in an entirely different manner. Where was Fix at the moment? He was actually on board the General Grant. On reaching Yokohama, the detective, leaving Mr. Fogg, whom he expected to meet again during the day, had repaired at once to the English consulate, where he had at last found the warrant of arrest. It had followed him from Bombay, and had come by the Carnatic, on which steamer he himself was supposed to be. Fix's disappointment may be imagined when he reflected that the warrant was now useless. Mr. Fogg had left English ground, and it was now necessary to procure his extradition. Well, thought Fix in a moment of anger, my warrant is not good here, but it will be in England. The rogue evidently intends to return to his own country, thinking he has thrown the police off his track. Good, I will follow him across the Atlantic. As for the money, heaven grant that there be some left. But the fellow was already spending traveling, rewards, trials, bails, elephant, and all sorts of charges, more than £5,000. Yet after all, the bank is rich. His course decided on, he went on board the General Grant, and was there Mr. Fogg and Ayudo arrived. To his utter amazement, he recognized Passepartout, despite his theatrical disguise. He quickly concealed himself upon his cabin to avoid an awkward explanation, and hoped, thanks to the number of passengers, to remain unperceived by Mr. Fogg's servant. On that very day, however, he met Passepartout face to face on the forward deck. The latter, without much a word, made a rush for him, grasped him by the throat, and, much to the amusement of the group of Americans, who immediately began to bet on him, administered to the detective a perfect volley of blows, which proved the great superiority of French over English pugilistic skill. When Passepartout had finished, he found himself relieved and comforted. Fix got up in somewhat rumbled condition, and, looking at his adversary, coldly said, "Have you done?" "For this time, yes. Then let me have a word with you, but in your master's interests." Passepartout seemed to be vanquished by Fix's coolness, for he quietly followed him, and they sat down aside from the rest of the passengers. "You have given me a thrashing," said Fix. "Good. I expected it. Now listen to me. Up to this time I have been Mr. Fogg's adversary. Now I am in his game." "Aha!" cried Passepartout. "You are convinced he is an honest man." "No," replied Fix coldly. "I think him a rascal. Don't budge and let me speak. As long as Mr. Fogg was on English ground, it was for my interest to detain him there until my warrant of arrest arrived. I did everything I could to keep him back. I sent the Bombay priest after him. I got you intoxicated in Hong Kong. I separated you from him. I made him miss the Yokohama steamer." Passepartout listened with closed fists. "Now," resumed Fix, "Mr. Fogg seems to be going back to England. Well, I will follow him there, but after I will do as much to keep obstacles out of his way as I've done up this time to put them in his path. I've changed my game, you see, and simply because it was for my interest to change it. Your interest is the same as mine, for it is only in England that you will ascertain whether you are in the same service of a criminal or an honest man." Passepartout listened very attentively to Fix, and was convinced he spoke with entire good faith. "Are we friends?" asked the detective. "Friends? No," replied Passepartout, "but allies, perhaps. At the least sign of treason, however, I will tryst your neck for you." "Agreed," said the detective quietly. 11 days later, on the 3rd of December, the General Grant entered the Bay of the Golden Gate and reached San Francisco. Mr. Fogg had neither gained nor lost a single day. End of Chapter 24. Chapter 25, in which a slight glimpse is had of San Francisco. It was 7 in the morning when Mr. Fogg, Ayudo, and Passepartout set foot upon the American continent, and if this name can be given to the floating quay upon which they disembarked, these quays, rising and falling with the tide, thus facilitate the loading and unloading of vessels. Alongside them were clippers of all sizes, steamers of all nationalities, and the steamboats with several decks rising one above the other, which ply on the Sacramento and its tributaries. These were also heaped upon the products of the commerce which extend to Mexico, Chile, Peru, Brazil, Europe, Asia, and all the Pacific Islands. Passepartout, in his joy on reaching at last the American continent, thought he would manifest it by executing a perilous vault in fine style, but tumbling upon some worm-eaten planks, he fell through them. Put out of countenance by the manner of which he just set foot upon the new world, he uttered a loud cry which so frightened the innumerable cormorants and pelicans that were always perched upon these unmovable quays that they flew noisily away. Mr. Fogg, on reaching the shore, produced to find out what hour the first train left for New York, and learned that it was 6:00 p.m. He had therefore an entire day to spend in the Californian capital. Taking carriage at the charge of $3, he and Aouda entered it. While Passepartout mounted the box beside the driver, they set out for the International Hotel. From his exalted position, Passepartout observed with much curiosity the wide streets, the low, evenly ranged houses, the Anglo-Saxon Gothic churches, the great docks, the palatial wooden and brick warehouses, the numerous conveyances, omnibuses, horse cars, and upon the sidewalks, not only Americans and Europeans, but Chinese and Indians. Passepartout was surprised that all he saw, San Francisco, was no longer the legendary city of 1849, a city of banditti, assassins, and incendiaries who had flocked thither in crowds in pursuit of plunder, a paradise of outlaws where they gambled with gold dust, a revolver in one hand and a bowie knife in the other. It was now a great commercial emporium. The lofty tower of its city hall overlooked the whole panorama of the streets and avenues, which cut each other at right angles, and in the midst of which appeared pleasant verdant squares, while beyond appeared the Chinese quarter, seemingly imported from the Celestial Empire in a toy box. Sombreros and red shirts and plumed Indians were rarely to be seen, but there were silk hats and black coats everywhere, worn by a multitude of nervously active, gentlemanly-looking men. Some of the street, especially Montgomery Street, which is to San Francisco what Regent Street is to London, the Boulevard des Italiens to Paris, and Broadway to New York, were lined with splendid and spacious stores which exposed in their windows the products of the entire world. When Passepartout reached an international hotel, he did not seem to him as if he had left England at all. The ground floor of the hotel was occupied by a large bar, a sort of restaurant freely open to all passers-by who might partake of dried beef, oyster soup, biscuits, and cheese without taking out their purses. Payment was made only for the ale, porter or sherry, which was drunk. This seemed very American to Passepartout. The hotel refreshment rooms were comfortable, and Mr. Fogg and Aouda, installing themselves at a table, were abundantly served on a diminutive place by negroes of the darkest hue. After breakfast, Mr. Fogg, accompanied by Aouda, started for the English consulate to have his passport visaed. As he was going out, he met Passepartout, who asked him if he would not be well before taking the train to purchase some dozens of Enfield rifles and Colt's revolvers. He had been listening to the stories of attacks upon the trains by the Sioux and the Pawnees. Mr. Fogg thought it a useless precaution, but told him to do as he thought best, and went on to the consulate. He had not proceeded 200 steps, however, when, with the greatest chance of the world, he met Fix. The detective seemed wholly taken by surprise. What? Had Mr. Fogg and himself crossed the Pacific together, and not met on the steamer? At least Fix felt honored to behold once more the gentleman to whom he owed so much, and, as his business recalled him to Europe, he should be delighted to continue the journey in such pleasant company. Mr. Fogg replied that the honor would be his, and the detective, who was determined not to lose sight of him, begged permission to accompany them in their walk about San Francisco, a request which Mr. Fogg readily granted. They soon found themselves in Montgomery Street, where a great crowd was collected. The sidewalks, street, horse-car trails, and shop doors, the windows of the houses, even the roofs, were full of people. Men were going about carrying large posters and flags, and streamers were floating in the wind, while loud cries were heard on every hand. Hurrah for Hammerfield! Hurrah for Mandaboy! It was a political meeting, at least so Fix conjectured, who said to Mr. Fogg, "Perhaps we better not mingle with the crowd. There may be danger in it." "Yes," returned Mr. Fogg, "and blows, even if they are political, are still blows." Fix smiled at this remark, and, in order to be able to see without being jostled about, the party took up a position on the top of the flight of steps situated at the upper end of Montgomery Street. Opposite them, on the other side of the street, between a coal wharf and a petroleum warehouse, a large platform had been erected in the open air, towards which the current of the crowd seems to be directed. For what purpose was this meeting? What was the occasion of this excited assemblage? Phileas Fogg could not imagine. Was it to nominate some high official? A governor, a member of Congress? It was not improbable, so agitated was the multitude before them. Just at this moment there was an unusual stir in the human mass. All the hands were raised in the air. Some tightly closed seemed to disappear suddenly in the midst of cries. An energetic way, no doubt, of casting a vote. A crowd swayed back. The banners and flags waved, disappeared in an instant, then reappeared in tanders. The undulations of the human surge reached the steps, while all the heads floundered on the surface like a sea agitated by a squall. Many of the black hats disappeared. The greater part of the crowd seemed to have diminished in height. "It's evidently a meeting," said Fix, "and its object must be an exciting one. I should not wonder if it were about the Alabama, despite the fact that question is settled." "Perhaps," replied Mr. Fogg simply. "At least there are two champions in presence of each other, the Honorable Mr. Cammerfield and the Honorable Mr. Mandelboy." Ayuda, leaning upon Mr. Fogg's arm, observed the tumultuous scene with surprise, while Fix asked a man near him what the cause of it was all about. Before the man could reply, a fresh agitation rose. Hurrahs and excited shouts were heard. The staffs of banners began to use offensive weapons, and fists flew about in every direction. Thumps were exchanged from the tops of carriages and omnibuses which had been blocked up in the crowd. Boots and shoes went whirling through the air, and Mr. Fogg thought he even heard the crack of revolvers mingling in the din. The rout approached the stairway and flowed over the lower step. One of the parties had evidently been repulsed, but the mere lookers-on could not tell whether Mandelboy or Cammerfield had gained the upper hand. "It would be prudent for us to retire," said Fix, who was anxious that Mr. Fogg should not receive any injury, at least until they got back to London. "If there is any question about England and all this, and we are recognized, I fear it would go hard with us." "An English subject," began Mr. Fogg. He did not finish his sentence, for a terrific hubbub now rose on the terrace behind the flights of steps where they stood, and there were frantic shouts of "Hurrah for Mandelboy! Hip hip hurrah!" It was a band of voters coming to the rescue of their allies and taking the Cammerfield forces in flank. Mr. Fogg, Ayuda, and Fix found themselves between two fires. It was too late to escape. The torrent of men armed with loaded canes and sticks was irresistible. Phileas Fogg and Fix were roughly hustled in their attempts to protect their fair companion. The former, as cool as ever, tried to defend himself with the weapons which nature had placed at the very end of every Englishman's arm, but in vain. A big, brawny fellow with a red beard, flushed face, and broad shoulders, who seemed to be the chief of his band, raised his clenched fist to strike Mr. Fogg, whom he would have given an enormous, crushing blow had not Fix rushed in and received it instead. An enormous bruise immediately made its appearance under the detective's silk hat, which was completely smashed in. "Yankee," exclaimed Mr. Fogg, daring a contemptuous look at the ruffian. "Englishman," returned the other. "We will meet again." "When you please. What's your name? Phileas Fogg, and yours?" "Colonel Stamp Proctor." The human tide now swept by, after overturning Fix, who speedily got upon his feet again, though with tattered clothes. Happily, he was not seriously hurt. His traveling overcoat was divided into two unequal parts, and his trousers resembled those of certain Indians, which fit less compactly than they are easy to put on. Ayuda had escaped unharmed, and Fix alone bore marks of the fray in his black and blue bruise. "Thanks," said Mr. Fogg to the detective, as soon as they were out of the crowd. "No thanks are necessary," replied Fix, "but let us go." "Where?" "To a tailor's." Such a visit was indeed opportune. The clothing of both Mr. Fogg and Fix was in rags, as if they had themselves been actively engaged in the contest between Cammerfield and Mandelboy. An hour after, they were once more suitably attired, and with Ayuda returned to the International Hotel. Passepartout was waiting for his master, armed with a half-dozen six-barreled revolvers. When he perceived Fix, he knit his brows, but Ayuda, having in few words told him of their adventure, his countenance resumed its placid expression. Fix evidently was no longer an enemy, but an ally. He was faithful, keeping his word. Dinner over, the coach which was to convey the passengers and their luggage to the station drew up to the door. As he was getting in, Mr. Fogg said to Fix, "You have not seen this Colonel Proctor again?" "No." "I will come back to America to find him," said Phileas Fogg calmly. "It would not be right for an Englishman to permit himself to be treated in that way without retaliating." The detective smiled but did not reply. It was clear that Mr. Fogg was one of those Englishmen who, while they did not tolerate dueling at home, fight abroad when their honor is attacked. At 6:15, the travelers reached the station and found the train ready to depart. As he was about to enter it, Mr. Fogg called the porter and said to him, "My friend, was there not some trouble today in San Francisco?" "It was a political meeting, sir," replied the porter, "but I thought there was a great deal of disturbance in the streets." "It was only a meeting of the assembled for an election." "An election of the general-in-chief, no doubt?" asked Mr. Fogg. "No, sir, a justice of the peace." Phileas Fogg got into the train, which started off at full speed. End of Chapter 25. Chapter 26, in which Phileas Fogg and party travel by the Pacific Railroad. From ocean to ocean, so say the Americans, and these four words compose the general designation of the Great Trunk Line, which crosses the entire width of the United States. The Pacific Railroad is, however, really divided into two distinct lines. The Central Pacific between San Francisco and Ogden, and the Union Pacific between Ogden and Omaha. 5 main lines connect Omaha with New York. New York and San Francisco are thus united by an uninterrupted middle ribbon which measures no less than 3,786 miles. Between Omaha and the Pacific, the railway crosses a territory which is still infested by Indians and wild beasts, and a large tract which the Mormons, after they were driven from Illinois in 1845, began to colonize. The journey from New York to San Francisco consumed, formerly under the most favorable conditions, at least 6 months. It is now accomplished in 7 days. It was in 1862 that, in spite of the Southern members of Congress who wished a more southerly route, it was decided to lay the road between the 41st and 42nd parallels. President Lincoln himself fixed the end of the line at Omaha in Nebraska. The work was at once commenced and pursued with true American energy, nor did the rapidity with which it went on injuriously affect its good execution. The road grew on the prairies 1.5 miles a day. A locomotive running on the rails laid down the evening before brought the rails to be laid on the morrow, and advanced upon them as fast as they were put in position. The Pacific Railroad is joined by several branches in Iowa, Kansas, Colorado, and Oregon. On leaving Omaha, it passes along the left bank of the Platte River as far as the junction of its northern branch. It follows the southern branch, crosses the Laramie Territory in the Watash Mountains, turns the Great Salt Lake and reaches Salt Lake City, the Mormon capital, plunges into the Tolueno Valley, across the American Desert, Cedar and Humboldt Mountains, the Sierra Nevada, and descends via Sacramento to the Pacific, its grade, even on the Rocky Mountains, never exceeding 112 feet to the mile. Such was the road to be traversed in 7 days, which would enable Phileas Fogg, at least so he hoped, to take the Atlantic steamer at New York on the 11th for Liverpool. The car which he occupied was a sort of long omnibus with 8 wheels, and with no compartments in the interior, it was supplied with 2 rows of seats perpendicular to the direction of the train on either side of the aisle, which conducted to the front and rear platforms. These platforms were found throughout the train, and the passengers were able to pass from one end of the train to the other. It was supplied with saloon cars, balcony cars, restaurant and smoking cars. Theater cars alone were wanting, and they will all have these someday. Book and news dealers, seller of edibles, drinkables, and cigars, who seemed to have plenty of customers, were continually circulating the aisles. The train left Oakland Station at 6 o'clock. It was already night, cold and cheerless, and the heavens being overcast with clouds which did not seem to threaten snow, the train did not proceed rapidly. Counting the stoppages, it did not run more than 20 miles an hour, which was a sufficient speed, however, to enable it to reach Omaha within its designated time. There was but little conversation in the car, and soon many of the passengers were overcome with sleep. Passepartout found himself beside the detective, but he did not talk to him. After recent events, their relations with each other had grown somewhat cold. There could no longer be mutual sympathy or intimacy between them. Fix's manner had not changed, but Passepartout was very reserved and ready to strangle his former friend on the slightest provocation. Snow began to fall an hour after they had started, a fine snow, however, which could absolutely not obstruct the train. Nothing could be seen from the windows but a vast white sheet against which the smoke of the locomotive had a grayish aspect. At 8 o'clock, a steward entered the car and announced that the time for going to bed had arrived, and in a few minutes the car was transformed into a dormitory. The backs of seats were thrown back, bedsteads carefully packed were rolled over by an ingenious system. Berths were suddenly improvised, and each traveler had soon at his disposition a comfortable bed, protected from curious eyes by thick curtains. The sheets were clean and the pillows soft. It only remained to go to bed and sleep, which everybody did, while the train sped across the state of California. The country between San Francisco and Sacramento is not very hilly. The Central Pacific, taking Sacramento for its starting point, extends eastward to meet the road from Omaha. The line from San Francisco to Sacramento runs a northeasterly direction, along the American River, which empties into San Pablo Bay. The 120 miles between these cities were accomplished in 6 hours, and towards midnight, while fast asleep, the travelers passed through Sacramento, so that they saw nothing of the important place, the seat of the state of government with its fine quays, its broad streets, its noble hotels, squares, and churches. The train, on leaving Sacramento and passing the junction of Rosslyn, Auburn, and Colfax, entered the range of the Sierra Nevada. Cisco was reached at 7 in the morning. An hour later, the dormitory was transformed into an ordinary car, and the travelers could observe the picturesque beauties of the mountain region through which they were steaming. The railway track wound in and out among the passes, now approaching the mountainsides, now suspended over the precipices, avoiding abrupt angles by bold curves, plunging into narrow defiles, which seemed to have no outlet. The locomotive, its great funnel emitting a weird light with a sharp bell and its cowcatcher extended like a spur, mingled its shrieks and bellowings with the noise of torrents and cascades, and twined its smoke among the branches of the gigantic pines. There were few or no bridges and no tunnels on the route. The railway turned around the sides of the mountain and did not attempt to violate nature by taking the shortest cut from one point to another. The train entered the state of Nevada through the Carson Valley about 9 o'clock, going always northeasterly, and at midday reached Reno, where there was a delay of 20 minutes for breakfast. From this point the road, running along Humboldt River, passed northward for several miles by its banks. Then it turned to eastward, and kept by the river until it reached the Humboldt Range, nearly at the extreme eastern limit of Nevada. Having breakfast, Mr. Fogg and his companions resumed their places in the car and observed the varied landscape which unfolded itself as they passed along the vast prairies, the mountains lining the horizon, the creeks with their frothy foaming streams. Sometimes a great herd of buffaloes, massing together in the distance, seemed like a movable dam. These innumerable multitudes of ruminating beasts often form an insurmountable obstacle to the passage of trains. Thousands of them have been seen passing over the track for hours together in compact ranks. The locomotive is then forced to stop and wait once more until the road is clear. This happened indeed to the train in which Mr. Fogg was traveling. About 12 o'clock, a group of 10 or 12,000 head of buffalo encumbered the track. The locomotive, slackening its speed, tried to clear the way with its cowcatcher, but the mass of animals was too great. The buffaloes marched along with a tranquil gait, uttering now and then the deafening bellowings. There is no use of interrupting them, for having taken a particular direction, nothing can moderate and change their course. It is a torrent of living flesh which no dam could contain. The travelers gazed on this curious spectacle from the platforms, but Phileas Fogg, who had the most reason of all to be in a hurry, remained in his seat, and waited philosophically until it should please the buffaloes to get on out of the way. Passepartout was furious at the delay they occasioned, and longed to discharge his arsenal of revolvers upon them. "What a country," cried he. "Mere cattle stop the trains, and go by in procession, just as if they were on unimpeding travel. Parbleu! I should like to know if Mr. Fogg foresaw this mishap in his program. And here's an engineer who doesn't care to run the locomotive into the herd of beasts." The engineer did not try to overcome the obstacle, and he was wise. He would have crushed the first buffaloes, no doubt with the cowherder, but the locomotive, however powerful, would have soon been checked. The train would have inevitably been thrown off the track and would have been helpless. The best course was to wait patiently and regain the lost time by greater speed when the obstacle was removed. The procession of buffaloes lasted 3 full hours, and it was night before the track was clear. The last ranks of the herd were now passing over the rails, while the first had already disappeared below the southern horizon. It was 8 o'clock when the train passed through the defiles of Humboldt Range, and 9:30 when it penetrated Utah, the region of the Great Salt Lake, the singular colony of the Mormons. End of Chapter 26. Chapter 27, in which Passepartout undergoes, at a speed of 20 miles an hour, a course of Mormon history. During the night on the 5th of December, a train ran southeasterly for about 50 miles, then rose an equal distance in a northeasterly direction towards the Great Salt Lake. Passepartout, about 9 o'clock, went out upon the platform to take in the air. The weather was cold, the heavens gray, but it was not snowing. The sun's disk, enlarged by the mist, seemed an enormous ring of gold, and Passepartout was amusing himself by calculating its value in pounds sterling, when he was diverted from this interesting study by a strange-looking personage who made his appearance on the platform. This personage, who had taken the train at Elko, was tall and dark, with black mustache, black stockings, black silk hat, a black waistcoat, black trousers, a white cravat, and dogskin gloves. He might have been taken for a clergyman. He ran from one end of the train to the other, and affixed to the door of each car a notice written in manuscript. Passepartout approached and read one of these notices, which stated that Elder William Hitch, Mormon missionary, taking advantage of his presence on train number 48, would deliver a lecture on Mormonism in car number 117 from 11 to 12 o'clock, and that he invited all who were desirous of being instructed concerning the mysteries of the religion of the Latter-day Saints to attend. "I'll go," said Passepartout to himself. He knew nothing of Mormonism except the custom of polygamy, which is its foundation. The news quickly spread through the train, which contained about 100 passengers, 30 of whom, at most, attracted by the notice, ensconced themselves in car number 117. Passepartout took one of the front seats. Neither Mr. Fogg nor Fix cared to attend. At the appointed hour, Elder William Hitch rose, and in an irritated voice, as if he had already been contradicted, said, "I tell you that Joe Smith is a martyr, that his brother Hiram is a martyr, and the persecutions of the United States government dare against the prophets will also make a martyr of Brigham Young. Who dares to say the contrary?" No one ventured to gainsay the missionary, whose excited tone contrasted curiously with his natural calm visage. No doubt his anger arose from the hardships to which the Mormons were actually subjected. The government had just succeeded with some difficulty in reducing these independent fanatics to its rule. It had made itself master of Utah and subjugated that territory to the laws of the Union. After imprisoning Brigham Young on a charge of rebellion and polygamy, the disciples of the prophet had since redoubled their efforts and resisted, by words at least, the authority of Congress. Elder Hitch, as is seen, was trying to make precedents on the very railway trains. Then, emphasizing his words with his loud voice and frequent gestures, he related the story of the Mormons from biblical times, how that in Israel a Mormon prophet of the tribe of Joseph published the annals of the new religion and bequeathed them to his son Mormon, how many centuries later a translation of this precious book, which was written in Egyptian, was made by Joseph Smith, Jr., a Vermont farmer who revealed himself as a mystical prophet in 1825, and how, in short, the celestial messenger appeared to him in an illuminated forest and gave him the annals of the Lord. Several of the audience, not being much interested in the missionary's narrative, however, left the car, but Elder Hitch, continuing his lecture, related how Smith Jr., with his father, 2 brothers, a few disciples, founded the Church of the Latter-day Saints, which adopted not only in America, but in England, Norway, Sweden, and Germany, counts many artisans, as well as men engaged in the liberal professions among its members. How a colony was established in Ohio, a temple erected there at the cost of $200,000, and a town built at Kirkland. How Smith became an enterprising banker and received from a simple mummy showman a papyrus scroll written by Abraham and several famous Egyptians. The elder's story was somewhat wearisome, and his audience grew gradually less, until it was reduced to 20 passengers. But this did not disconcert the enthusiast, who proceeded with the story of Joseph Smith's bankruptcy in 1837, and how his ruined creditors gave him a coat of tar and feathers. His reappearance some years afterwards, more honorable and honored than ever, at Independence, Missouri, the chief of a flourishing colony of 3,000 disciples, and his pursuit thence by outraged Gentiles and retirement to the far west. 10 hearers were now left, among them honest Passepartout, who was listening with all his ears. Thus he learned that, after long persecutions, Smith reappeared in Illinois, and in 1839 founded a community at Nauvoo on the Mississippi, numbering 25,000 souls, of which he became mayor, chief justice, and general-in-chief. That he announced himself in 1843 as a candidate for the presidency of the United States, and that finally, being drawn into ambuscade at Carthage, he was thrown into prison and assassinated by a band of men disguised in masks. Passepartout was now the only person left in the car, and the elder, looking him full in the face, reminded him that 2 years after the assassination of Joseph Smith, the inspired prophet Brigham Young, his successor, left Nauvoo for the banks of the Great Salt Lake, where in the midst of that fertile region, directly en route of the immigrants who crossed Utah on their way to California, the new colony, thanks to the polygamy practiced by the Mormons, had flourished beyond expectation. And this, added William Hitch, this is why the jealousy of Congress has been aroused against us. Why have the soldiers of the Union invaded the soil of Utah? Why has Brigham Young, our chief, been imprisoned in contempt of all justice? Shall we yield to force? Never. Driven from Vermont, driven from Illinois, driven from Ohio, driven from Missouri, driven from Utah, we shall yet find some independent territory under which to plant our tents. And you, my brother, continued the elder, fixing his angry eyes upon his single auditor, will not plant yours there, too, under the shadow of our flag. No, replied Passepartout courageously, in his turn retiring from the car and leaving the elder to preach to vacancy. During the lecture, the train had been making good progress. Towards 12:30, it reached the northwest border of the Great Salt Lake. Thence the passengers could observe the vast extent of the interior sea, which was also called the Dead Sea, and into which flows the American Jordan. It is a picturesque expanse, framed in lofty crags and large strata, encrusted with white salt, a superb sheet of water, which was formerly larger extent than now, its shores having encroached with the lapse of time, and thus once reduced its breadth and increased its depth. The Salt Lake, 70 miles long and 35 wide, is situated 3 miles, 800 feet above the sea, quite different from Lake Asphaltite, whose depression is 1,200 feet below the sea. It contains considerable salt, and 1/4 of the weight of its water is solid matter. The specific weight having been 1,170, and after being distilled 1,000. Fishes are, of course, unable to live in it, and those which descend through the Jordan water and other streams soon perish. The country around the lake was well cultivated, for the Mormons are mostly farmers, while ranchers and pens for domesticated animals, fields of wheat, corn, and other cereals, luxuriant prairies, hedges of wild rose, clumps of acacias, and milkwort would have seen 6 months later. Now the ground was covered with a thin powdering of snow. The train reached Ogden at 2 o'clock, where it rested for 6 hours. Mr. Fogg and his party had time to pay a visit to Salt Lake City. connected with Ogden by a branch road, and they spent 2 hours in this strikingly American town, built on the pattern of other cities of the Union like a checkerboard, with the somber sadness of right angles, as Victor Hugo expresses it. The founder of the City of the Saints could not escape from the taste of symmetry which distinguishes the Anglo-Saxons in this strange country, where people are certainly not up to the level of their institutions. Everything is done squarely, cities, houses, and follies. The travelers then were promenading at 3 o'clock about the streets of the town built between the banks of the Jordan and the spurs of the Watash Range. They saw few or no churches, but the prophet's mansion, the courthouse, and the arsenal. Blue brick houses with verandas and porches, surrounded by gardens bordered with acacias, palm, and locusts. A clay and pebble wall built in 1853 surrounded the town, and a principal street with a market and several hotels adorned with pavilions. The place did not seem thickly populated. The streets were almost deserted, except in the vicinity of the temple, which they only reached after having traversed several quarters surrounded by palisades. There were many women, which was easily accounted for by the peculiar institution of the Mormons, but it must not be supposed that all Mormons are polygamists. They are free to marry or not as they pleased, but it is worth noting that it is mainly the female citizens of Utah who are anxious to marry, as according to the Mormon religion, maiden ladies are not admitted to the possession of its highest joys. These poor creatures seemed to be neither well off nor happy. Some, the more well-to-do no doubt, wore short, open black silk dresses under a hood or modest shawl. Others were habited in Indian fashion. Passepartout could not behold without a certain fright these women, charged in groups with conferring happiness on a single Mormon. His common sense pitied above all the husband. It seemed to him a terrible thing to have to guide so many wives at once across the vicissitudes of life, and to conduct them, as it were, in a body to the Mormon paradise, with the prospect of seeing them in the company of the glorious Smith, who doubtless was the chief ornament of that delightful place to all eternity. He felt decidedly repelled from such a vocation, and he imagined, perhaps he was mistaken, that the fair ones of Salt Lake City cast rather alarming glances on his person. Happily his stay there was but brief. At 4 the party found themselves again at the station, and took their places in the train, and the whistle sounded for the starting. Just at the moment, however, the locomotive wheels began to move, cries of "Stop, stop" were heard. Trains, like time and tide, stopped for no one. The gentleman who uttered the cries was evidently a belated Mormon. He was breathless with running. Happily for him, the station had neither gates nor barriers. He rushed along the track, jumped on the rear platform of the train, and fell, exhausted, into one of the seats. Passepartout, who had been anxiously watching this amateur gymnast, approached him with lively interest, and learned that he had taken flight after an unpleasant domestic scene. When the Mormon had recovered his breath, Passepartout ventured to ask him politely how many wives he had, for, from the manner with which he had decamped, it might be thought of that he had 20 at least. "One, sir," replied the Mormon, raising his arms, having a word. "One, and that was enough." End of chapter 27. Chapter 28, in which Passepartout does not succeed in making anybody listen to reason. The train, on leaving Great Salt Lake at Ogden, passed northward for an hour as far as the Weber River. Having completed nearly 900 miles from San Francisco, from this point it took an easterly direction towards the jagged Wasatch Mountains. It was in the section included between this range and the Rocky Mountains that the American engineers found the most formidable difficulties in laying the road, and that the government granted a subsidy of $48,000 per mile instead of $16,000 allowed for the work done on the plains. But the engineers, instead of violating nature, avoided its difficulties by winding around instead of penetrating the rocks. One tunnel only, 14,000 feet in length, was pierced in order to arrive at the Great Basin. The track up to this time had reached its highest elevation at the Great Salt Lake. From this point, it described a long curve, descending towards Bitter Creek Valley to rise again at the dividing ridge of the waters between the Atlantic and Pacific. There were many creeks in this mountainous region, and it was necessary to cross Muddy Creek, Green Creek, and others upon culverts. Passepartout grew more and more impatient as they went on, while Fix longed to get out of this difficult region, and was more anxious than Phileas Fogg himself to be beyond the danger of delays and accidents, and set foot on English soil. At 10 o'clock at night, the train stopped at Fort Bridger Station, and 20 minutes later entered the Wyoming Territory. Followed by the valley of Bitter Creek throughout, the next day, 7th December, they stopped for a quarter of an hour at Green River Station. Snow had fallen abundantly during the night, but being mixed with rain, it half melted. It did not interrupt the progress. The bad weather, however, annoyed Passepartout, for the accumulation of snow by blocking the wheels of cars would have certainly been fatal to Mr. Fogg's tour. "What's an idea?" he said to himself. "Why did my master make this journey in winter? Couldn't he have waited for a good season to increase his chances?" While the worthy Frenchman was absorbed in a state of sky and depression of the temperature, Aouda was experiencing fears from a totally different cause. Several passengers had got off at Green River and were walking up and down the platforms. Among these, Aouda recognized Colonel Stamp Proctor, the same who had grossly insulted Phileas Fogg at the San Francisco meeting. Not wishing to be recognized, the young woman drew back from the window, feeling much alarm at her discovery. She was attached to the man who, however coldly, gave her daily evidences of the most absolute devotion. She did not comprehend, perhaps, the depth of the sentiment with which her protector inspired her, which she called gratitude, but which, though she was unconscious of it, was really more than that. Her heart sank within her when she recognized the man whom Mr. Fogg desired, sooner or later, to call into account for his conduct. Chance alone, it was clear, had brought Colonel Proctor on this train. But there he was, and it was necessary, at all hazards, that Phileas Fogg should not perceive his adversary. Aouda seized a moment when Mr. Fogg was asleep to tell Fix and Passepartout whom she had seen. "That Proctor is on this train," cried Fix. "Well, reassure yourself, madam. Before he settles with Mr. Fogg, he has got to deal with me. It seems that I was the more insulted of the two. And besides," added Passepartout, "I'll take charge of him, colonel, as he is." "Mr. Fix," resumed Aouda, "Mr. Fogg would allow no one to avenge him. He said he would come back to America to find this man. Should he receive Colonel Proctor, we could not prevent a collision which might have terrible results. He must not see him." "You are right, madam," replied Fix. "A meeting between them might ruin all. Whether he were victorious or beaten, Mr. Fogg would be delayed and, added Passepartout, that would play the game of the gentlemen of the Reform Club. In 4 days we shall be in New York. If my master does not leave his car during these 4 days, we may hope that chance will not bring him face to face with this confounded American. We must, if possible, prevent the stirring out of it." The conversation dropped. Mr. Fogg had just woke up and was looking out of the window. Soon after, Passepartout, without being heard by his master Aouda, whispered to the detective, "Would you really fight for him?" "I would do anything," replied Fix, in a tone which betrayed determined will, "to get him living back to Europe." Passepartout felt something like a shudder shoot through his frame, but his confidence in his master remained unbroken. Was there any means of detaining Mr. Fogg in this car, to avoid a meeting between him and the colonel? It ought not to be a difficult task, since that gentleman was naturally sedentary and a little curious. The detective, at least, seemed to have found a way, for after a few moments he said to Mr. Fogg, "These are long and slow hours, sir, that we are passing on the railway." "Yes," replied Mr. Fogg, "but they pass." "You are in the habit of playing whist," resumed Fix, "on the steamers." "Yes, but it would be difficult to do so here. I have neither cards nor partners." "Oh, but we can easily buy some cards, for they are sold on all the American trains. As for partners, if madam plays—" "Certainly, sir," Aouda quickly replied. "I understand whist. It's a part of an English education. I myself having some pretensions to play a good game. Well, here are 3 of us and a dummy." "As you please, sir," replied Phileas Fogg, heartily glad to resume his favorite pastime, even on the railway. Passepartout was dispatched in search of the steward, and soon returned with 2 packs of cards, some pins, counters, and a shelf covered with cloth. The game commenced. Aouda understood whist sufficiently well, and even received some compliments on her playing from Mr. Fogg. As for the detective, he was simply an adept, and worthy of being matched against his present opponent. "Now," thought Passepartout, "we've got him, he won't budge." At 11 in the morning, the train had reached the dividing ridge of the waters of the Bridger Pass, 7,524 feet above the level of the sea, one of the highest points attained by the track in crossing the Rocky Mountains. After going about 200 miles, the travelers at last found themselves on one of those vast plains which extend to the Atlantic, and which nature has made so propitious for laying in the iron road. On the declivity of the Atlantic basin, the first streams, branches of the North Platte River, already appeared. The whole northern and eastern horizon was bounded by the immense semicircular curtain which is formed by the southern portion of the Rocky Mountains, the highest being Laramie Peak. Between these the railway extended vast plains, plentifully irrigated. On the right rose lower spurs of the mountainous pass which extends southward to the sources of the Arkansas River, one of the greatest tributaries of the Missouri. At 12:30, the travelers caught sight for an instant of Fort Halleck, which commands that section, and in a few more hours the Rocky Mountains were crossed. There was reason to hope, then, that no accident would mark their journey through this difficult country. The snow had ceased falling, and in the air became crisp and cold. Large birds, frightened by the locomotive, rose and flew off in the distance. No wild beast appeared on the plain. It was a desert in its vast nakedness. After a comfortable breakfast served in the car, Mr. Fogg and his partners had just resumed whist, when a violent whistling was heard and the train stopped. Passepartout put his head out the door, but saw nothing that caused delay. No station was in view. Aouda and Fix feared that Mr. Fogg might take it to his head to get out, but that gentleman contented himself with saying to his servant, "See what is the matter." Passepartout rushed out of the car. 30 or 40 passengers had descended, amongst them Colonel Stamp Proctor. The train had stopped before a red signal which blocked the way. The engineer and conductor were talking excitedly with the signalman, whom the station master at Medicine Bow, the next stopping place, had sent on before. The passengers drew around and took part in the discussion, in which Colonel Proctor, with his insolent manner, was conspicuous. Passepartout, joining the group, heard the signalman say, "No, you can't pass. The bridge at Medicine Bow is shaky and would not bear the weight of the train." This was a suspension bridge thrown over some rapids about a mile from the place where they now were. According to the signalman, it was a ruinous condition, several of the iron wires being broken, and it was possible to risk the passage. He did not in any way exaggerate the condition of the bridge. It may be taken for granted that, rash as the Americans usually are, when they are prudent, there's good reason for it. Passepartout, not daring to apprise his master of what he heard, listened with set teeth, immovable as a statue. Cried Colonel Proctor. "But we're not going to stay here, I imagine, and take root in the snow?" "Colonel," replied the conductor, "we have telegraphed to Omaha for a train, but it is not likely it will reach Medicine Bow in less than 6 hours. 6 hours, cried Passepartout. "Certainly," returned the conductor. "Besides, it will take us as long as that to reach Medicine Bow on foot." "But it's only a mile from here," said one of the passengers. "Yes, but it's on the other side of the river." "And can't we cross in a boat?" asked the colonel. "That's impossible. The creek is swelled by the rains. It is a rapid, for we shall have to make a circuit of 10 miles to the north to find a ford." The colonel launched a volley of oaths denouncing railway company and the conductor, and Passepartout, who was furious, was not disinclined to make common cause with him. Here was an obstacle indeed, which all his master's banknotes could not remove. There's a general disappointment among the passengers who, without reckoning the delay, saw themselves compelled to trudge 15 miles over a plain covered with snow. They grumbled and protested, and would certainly have thus attracted Phileas Fogg's attention if he had not been completely absorbed in his game. Passepartout found out that he could not avoid telling his master what had occurred, and with hanging head was turning towards the car when the engineer, a true Yankee named Forrester, called out, "Gentlemen, perhaps there is a way after all to get over." "On the bridge?" asked the passenger. "On the bridge. With our train?" "With our train." Passepartout stopped short and eagerly listened to the engineer. "But the bridge is unsafe," urged the conductor. "No matter," replied Forrester. "I think that by putting on the very highest speed we might have a chance of getting over." "The devil," murmured Passepartout. But a number of passengers were at once attracted by the engineer's proposal, and Colonel Proctor was especially delighted, and found the plan very feasible. He told stories about engineers leaping their trains over rivers without bridges by putting on full steam, and many of those present avowed themselves of the engineer's mind. "We have 50 chances out of 100 getting over," said one. 80, 90. Passepartout was astounded, and though ready to attempt anything to get over Medicine Creek, thought the experiment proposed a little too American. "Besides," thought he, "there is a still more simple way, and it doesn't even occur to any of these people. Sir," he said aloud to one of the passengers, "the engineer's plan seems to me a little dangerous, but 80 chances," replied the passenger, turning his back on him. "I know it," said Passepartout, turning to another passenger. "But a simple ideas are no use," returned the American, shrugging his shoulders, "as the engineer assures us that we can pass." "Doubtless," urged Passepartout, "we can pass, but perhaps it would be more prudent—" "What? Prudent?" cried Colonel Proctor, whose words seemed to excite prodigiously. "At full speed, don't you see? At full speed." "I know, I see. But it would be, if not more prudent, since that word displeases you, at least more natural." "Poof! What? What's the matter with this fellow?" cried several. The poor fellow did not know whom to address himself. "Are you afraid?" asked Colonel Proctor. "I afraid? Very well. I will show these people that a Frenchman can be as American as they." "All aboard," cried the conductor. "Yes, all aboard," repeated Passepartout, and immediately. "But they can prevent me from thinking that it would be more natural for us to cross the bridge on foot and let the train come after." But no one heard this sage reflection, nor would anyone have acknowledged its justice. The passengers resumed their places in the cars. Passepartout took a seat without telling what had passed. The whist players were quite absorbed in their game. The locomotive whistled vigorously. The engineer, reversing the steam, backed up the train for nearly a mile, retiring like a jumper in order to take a longer leap. Then, with another whistle, he began to move forward. The train increased its speed, and soon its rapidity became frightful. The prolonged screech issues from the locomotive. The piston worked up and down 20 strokes to the second. They perceived that the whole train, rushing on the rate of 100 miles an hour, hardly bore up the rails at all. And then they passed over. It was like a flash. No one saw the bridge. The train leaped, so to speak, from one bank to the other, and the engineer could not stop it until it had gone 5 miles beyond the station. But scarcely had the train passed the river when the bridge, completely ruined, fell with a crash into the rapids of Medicine Bow. End of Chapter 28. Chapter 29, in which certain incidents are narrated which are only to be met with on American railroads. The train pursued its course that evening without interruption, passing Fort Saunders, crossing Cheyenne Pass, and reaching Evans Pass. The road here attained the highest elevation of the journey, 8,092 feet above the level of the sea. The travelers now had only to descend to the Atlantic by the limitless plains leveled by nature. A branch of the Grand Trunk led off southward towards Denver, the capital of Colorado. The country round about is rich in gold and silver, and more than 50,000 inhabitants are already settled there. 1,382 miles have been passed over from San Francisco in 3 days and 3 nights. 4 days and nights more would probably bring them to New York. Phileas Fogg was not as yet behindhand. During the night, Camp Waback was passed on the left. Large Pole Creek ran parallel with the road, marking the boundary between the territories of Wyoming and Colorado. They entered Nebraska at 11, passed near Sedgwick, and touched at Julesburg on the southern branch of the Platte River. It was here that the Union Pacific Railroad was inaugurated on the 23rd of October, 1867, by Chief Engineer General Dodge. 2 powerful locomotives carrying 9 cars of invited guests, among of whom was Thomas C. Durant, vice president of the road, stopped at this point. Cheers were given, the Sioux and Pawnees performed an imitation Indian battle, fireworks were let off, and the first number of the Railway Pioneer was printed by a press brought on the train. Thus was celebrated the inauguration of this great railroad, a mighty instrument of progress and civilization, thrown across the desert and destined to link together more cities and towns which do not yet exist. The whistle of the locomotive, more powerful than Amphion's lyre, was about to bid them rise from the American soil. Fort McPherson was left behind at 8 in the morning, and 357 miles had yet to be traversed before reaching Omaha. The road followed the capricious windings of the southern branch of the Platte River. On its left bank, at 9 the train stopped at the important town of North Platte, built between the 2 arms of the river, which rejoined each other around it and formed a single artery on a large tributary whose waters empty into the Missouri a little above Omaha. The 101st meridian was passed. Mr. Fogg and his partners had resumed their game. Not one, not even the dummy, complained the length of the trip. Fix had begun by winning several guineas, which he seemed likely to lose. He showed himself a not less eager whist player than Mr. Fogg. During the morning, chance distinctly favored that gentleman. Trumps and honors were showered upon his hands. Once, having resolved on a bold stroke, he was on the point of playing a spade when a voice behind him said, "I should play a diamond." Mr. Fogg and Fix raised their heads and beheld Colonel Proctor. Stamp Proctor and Phileas Fogg recognized each other at once. "Ah, it's you, is it, Englishman?" cried the Colonel. "Is it you who are going to play a spade?" "And who plays it?" replied Phileas Fogg coolly, throwing down the 10 of spades. "Well, it pleases me to have it diamonds," replied Colonel Proctor in an insolent tone. He made a movement as to seize the card which had just been played, adding, "You don't understand anything about whist." "Perhaps I do, as well as another," said Phileas Fogg, rising. "You only have to try, son of John Bull," replied the Colonel. Aouda turned pale and her blood ran cold. She seized Mr. Fogg's arm and gently pulled him back. Passepartout was ready to pounce upon the American, who was staring instantly at his opponent, but Fix got up, and going to Colonel Proctor said, "You forget that it is whom you have to deal with, sir, for it was I whom you not only insulted but struck." "Mr. Fix," said Mr. Fogg, "pardon me, but this affair is mine and mine only. The Colonel has again insulted me by insisting that I should not play a spade, and he shall give me satisfaction for it." "When and where you will," replied the American, "whatever weapon you choose." Aouda in vain attempted to retain Mr. Fogg as vainly as the detective endeavored to make quarrel with his. Passepartout wished to throw the Colonel out of the window, but a sign from his master checked him. Phileas Fogg left the car, and the American followed upon the platform. "Sir," said Mr. Fogg to his adversary, "I am in great hurry to get back to Europe, and any delay whatever will be greatly to my disadvantage." "Well, what's that to me?" "Sir," said Mr. Fogg very politely, "after our meeting at San Francisco, I determined to return to America and find you as soon as I had completed the business which called me to England." "Really? Will you appoint a meeting for 6 months hence?" "Why not 10 years hence?" "I say 6 months," returned Phileas Fogg, "and I shall be at the place of the meeting promptly." "All this is an evasion," cried Stamp Proctor, "now or never." "Very good. You are going to New York?" "No." "To Chicago?" "No." "To Omaha?" "What difference is it to you? Do you know Plum Creek?" "No." "It's the next station. The train will be there in an hour, and we will stop there 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, several revolver shots could be exchanged." "Very well," said Mr. Fogg. "I will stop at Plum Creek, and I guess you'll stay there, too," added the American insolently. "Who knows?" replied Mr. Fogg, returning to the car as coolly as usual. He began to reassure Aouda, telling her that blusterers were never to be feared, and begged Fix to be his second at the approaching duel, a request which the detective could not refuse. Mr. Fogg resumed the interrupted game with perfect calmness. At 11 o'clock, the locomotive's whistle announced that they were approaching Plum Creek Station. Mr. Fogg rose and, followed by Fix, went out upon the platform. Passepartout accompanied him, carrying a pair of revolvers. Aouda remained in the car, as pale as death. The door of the next car opened and Colonel Proctor appeared on the platform, attended by a Yankee of his own stamp as his second. But just as the combatants were about to step off the train, the conductor hurried up and shouted, "You can't get off, gentlemen." "Why not?" "We are 20 minutes late. We shall not stop." "But I'm going to fight a duel with this gentleman." "I'm sorry," said the conductor, "but we shall be off at once. There's the bell ringing now." The train started. "I'm really very sorry, gentlemen," said the conductor. "Under any other circumstances, I should have been happy to oblige you. But after all, as you have not had time to fight here, why not fight as we go along?" "That wouldn't be convenient, perhaps, for this gentleman," said the colonel in a jeering tone. "It would be perfectly so," replied Phileas Fogg. "Well, we really are in America," thought Passepartout, "and the conductor is a gentleman of the first order." So muttering, he followed his master. The two combatants and their seconds and the conductor passed through the cars to the rear of the train. The last car was only occupied by a dozen passengers, who the conductor politely asked if they could not be so kind as to leave it vacant for a few moments, as the two gentlemen had an affair of honor to settle. The passengers granted the request with alacrity and straightway disappeared on the platform. The car, which was some 50 feet long, was very convenient for their purpose. The adversaries might march on the end of the other aisle and file at their ease. Never was a duel more easily arranged. Mr. Fogg and Colonel Proctor, each provided with 2 six-barreled revolvers, entered the car. The seconds remaining outside shut them in, and they were to begin firing at the first whistle of the locomotive, after an interval of 2 minutes. What remained of the two gentlemen could be taken from the car. Nothing could be more simple. Indeed, it was all so simple that Fix and Passepartout felt their hearts beating as if they would crack. They were listening for the whistle agreed upon when suddenly savage cries resounded in the air, accompanied by reports, which certainly did not issue from the car where the duelists were. The reports continued in front in the whole length of the train. Cries of terror proceeded from the interior of the cars. Colonel Proctor and Mr. Fogg, revolvers in hand, hastily quitted their prison and rushed forward where the noise was most clamorous. They perceived that the train was attacked by a band of Sioux. It was not the first attempt of these daring Indians, for more than once they had waylaid trains on the road. 100 of them had, according to their own habit, jumped upon the steps without stopping the train, with the ease of a clown mounting the horse at full gallop. The Sioux were armed with guns, from which came the reports, to which the passengers, who were almost all armed, responded by revolver shots. The Indians had first mounted the engine and half-stunned the engineer and stoker with blows from their muskets. A Sioux chief, wishing to stop the train but not knowing how to work the regulator, had opened wide instead of closing the stem valve, and the locomotive was plunging forward with terrific velocity. The Sioux at the same time invaded the cars, skipping like enraged monkeys over the roof, thrusting open doors and fighting hand-to-hand with the passengers. Penetrating the baggage car, they pillaged it, throwing the trunks out of the train. The cries and shots were constant. The travelers defended themselves bravely. Some of the cars were barricaded and sustained a siege, like moving forts carried along at a speed of 100 miles an hour. Aouda behaved courageously from the first. She defended herself like a true heroine with a revolver, which she shot through the broken windows whenever a savage made his appearance. 20 Sioux had fallen mortally wounded to the ground, and the wheels crushed those who fell upon the rails as if they had been worms. Several passengers, shot or stunned, lay on the seats. It was necessary to put an end to the struggle, which had lasted for 10 minutes, and which would result in the triumph of the Sioux if the train was not stopped. Fort Kearny Station, where there was a garrison, was only 2 miles distant, but that once passed, the Sioux would be masters of the train between Fort Kearny and the station beyond. The conductor was fighting beside Mr. Fogg when he was shot and fell. At the same moment he cried, "Unless this train is stopped in 5 minutes, we are lost." "It shall be stopped," said Phileas Fogg, preparing to rush from the car. "Stay, monsieur," cried Passepartout. "I will go." Mr. Fogg had not time to stop the brave fellow, who, opening a door unperceived by the Indians, succeeded in slipping under the car, and while the struggle continued and the balls whizzed across each other over his head, he made use of his old acrobatic experience, and with amazing agility worked his way under the cars, holding onto the chains, aiding himself by the bricks and the edges of the sashes, creeping from one car to another with marvelous skill, and thus gaining the forward end of the train. There, suspended by one hand between the baggage car and the tender, with the other he loosed the safety chains, but, owing to the traction, he would never have succeeded in unscrewing the yoking bar, had not a violent concussion jolted this bar out. The train, now detached from the engine, remained a little behind, whilst the locomotive rushed forward with increased speed. Carried on by the force already acquired, the train still moved for several minutes, but the brakes were worked and at last they stopped, less than 100 feet from Kearny Station. The soldiers of the fort, attracted by the shots, hurried up. The Sioux had not expected them and decamped in a body before the train entirely stopped. But the passengers counted each other on the station platform. Several were found missing, among others the courageous Frenchman whose devotion had just saved them. End of Chapter 29. Chapter 30, in which Phileas Fogg simply does his duty. 3 passengers, including Passepartout, had disappeared. Had they been killed in the struggle? Were they taken prisoners by the Sioux? It was impossible to tell. There were many wounded, but none mortally. Colonel Proctor was one of the most seriously hurt. He had fought bravely, and a ball had entered his groin. He was carried into the station with the other wounded passengers to receive such attention as could be of avail. Aouda was safe, and Phileas Fogg, who had been in the thickest of the fight, had not received a scratch. Fix was slightly wounded in the arm, but Passepartout was not to be found, and tears coursed down Aouda's cheeks. All the passengers had gotten out of the train, the wheels of which were stained with the blood. From the tires and spokes hung ragged pieces of flesh. As far as the eye could reach on the white plain behind, red trails were visible. The last Sioux were disappearing in the south, along the banks of the Republican River. Mr. Fogg, with folded arms, remained motionless. He had a serious decision to make. Aouda, standing near him, looked at him without speaking, and he understood her look. If his servant was a prisoner, ought he not to risk everything to rescue him from the Indians? "I will find him, living or dead," he said quietly to Aouda. "Ah, Mr. Fogg," she cried, clasping his hands and covering them with tears. Phileas Fogg, by this resolution, inevitably sacrificed himself. He pronounced his own doom. The delay of a single day would make him lose the steamer at New York, and his bet would be certainly lost. But as he thought, "It is my duty," he did not hesitate. The commanding officer of Fort Kearny was there. 100 of his soldiers had placed themselves in a position to defend the station, should the Sioux attack it. "Sir," said Mr. Fogg to the captain, "3 passengers have disappeared." "Dead?" asked the captain. "Dead or prisoners. That is the uncertainty which must be solved. Do you propose to pursue the Sioux?" "That's a serious thing to do, sir," returned the captain. "These Indians may retreat beyond Arkansas, and I cannot leave the fort unprotected." "The lives of 3 men are in question, sir," said Phileas Fogg. "Doubtless, but I can risk the lives of 50 men to save 3? "I don't know whether you can, sir, but you ought to do so." "Nobody here," returned the other, "has a right to teach me my duty." "Very well," said Mr. Fogg coldly. "I will go alone." "You, sir," cried Fix, coming up, "you go alone in pursuit of the Indians? Would you have me leave this poor fellow to perish? Him who every one in this present owns his life. I shall go." "No, sir, you shall not go alone," cried the captain, touched in spite of himself. "No, you are a brave man. 30 volunteers," he added, turning to the soldiers. The whole company started forward at once. The captain had only to pick his men. 30 were chosen, and an old sergeant placed at their head. "Thanks, Captain," said Mr. Fogg. "Will you let me go with you?" asked Fix. "Do as you please, sir, but if you wish to do me a favor, you will remain with Aouda in case anything should happen to me." A sudden pallor overspread the detective's face. Separate himself from the man who he had so persistently followed step by step? Leave him to wander about the desert? Fix gazed attentively at Mr. Fogg, and despite his suspicions and the struggle which was going on within him, he lowered his eyes before that calm and frank look. "I will stay," said he. A few minutes after, Mr. Fogg pressed the young woman's hand, and having confided to her his precious carpet-bag, went off with the sergeant and his little squad. But before going, he had said to the soldiers, "My friends, I will divide 5,000 among you if we save the prisoners." It was then a little past noon. Aouda retired to a waiting room, and there she waited alone, thinking of the simple and noble generosity, the tranquil courage of Phileas Fogg. He had sacrificed his fortune and was now risking his life, all without hesitation from duty, in silence. Fix did not have the same thoughts, and could scarcely conceal his agitation. He walked feverishly up and down the platform, but soon resumed his outward composure. He now saw the folly of which he had been guilty in letting Fogg go alone. What? This man who he had just followed around the world was permitted now to separate himself from him? He began to accuse and abuse himself, as if he were the director of police, administered to himself a sound lecture for his greenness. "I have been an idiot," he thought, "and this man will see it. He has gone, and he won't come back. But that is how I, Fix, who have in my pocket a warrant for his arrest, have been so fascinated by him. Decidedly, I am nothing but an ass." So reasoned the detective while the hours crept by all too slowly. He did not know what to do. Sometimes he was tempted to tell Aouda all, but he could not doubt how the young woman would receive his confidences. What course should he take? He thought of pursuing Fogg across the vast white plains. It did not seem impossible that he might overtake him. Footsteps were easily printed on the snow, but soon under a new sheet every imprint would be effaced. Fix became discouraged. He felt a sort of insurmountable longing to abandon the game altogether. He could now leave Fort Kearny Station and pursue his journey homeward in peace. Towards 2 o'clock in the afternoon, while it was snowing hard, long whistles were heard approaching from the east. A great shadow, preceded by a wild light, slowly advanced, appearing still larger through the mist, which gave it a fantastic aspect. No train was expected from the east, neither had there been time for the succor asked for by telegraph to arrive. The train from Omaha to San Francisco was not due till the next day. The mystery was soon explained. The locomotive, which was slowly approaching with deafening whistles, was that which, having been detached from the train, had continued its route with such terrific rapidity. Tearing off the unconscious engineer and stoker, it had run several miles. When the fire became low for want of fuel, the steam had slackened, and it nearly stopped an hour after, some 20 miles beyond Fort Kearney. Neither the engineer or the stoker was dead, and after remaining for some time in their swoon, had come to themselves. The train had then stopped. The engineer, when he had found himself in the desert in the locomotive without cars, understood what had happened. He could not imagine how the locomotive had become separated from the train, but he did not doubt that the train left behind was in distress. He did not hesitate what to do. It would be prudent to continue on to Omaha, for it would be dangerous to return to the train, which the Indians might still be engaged in pillaging. Nevertheless, he began to rebuild the fire in the furnace, and the pressure again mounted, and the locomotive returned, running backwards to Fort Kearney. This was what was whistling in the mist. The travelers were glad to see the locomotive resume its place at the head of the train. They could now continue the journey so terribly interrupted. Aouda, on seeing the locomotive come up, hurried out of the station and asked the conductor, "Are you going to start?" "At once, madam." "But the prisoners, our unfortunate fellow travelers." "I cannot interrupt the trip," replied the conductor. "We are already 3 hours behind the time." "And when will another train pass here from San Francisco?" "Tomorrow evening, madam." "Tomorrow evening? But then it will be too late. We must wait." "It is impossible," responded the conductor. "If you wish to go, please get in." "I will not go," said Aouda. Fix had heard this conversation a little while before. When there was no prospect of proceeding on the journey, he had made it up his mind to leave Fort Kearney. But now that the train was there, ready to start, he had only to take his seat in the car. An irresistible influence held him back. The station platform burned his feet, and he could not stir. The conflict in his mind began again. Anger of failure stifled him. He wished to struggle on to an end. Meanwhile, the passengers and some of the wounded, among them Colonel Proctor, whose injuries were serious, had taken their places in the train. The buzzing of the overheated boiler was heard, and the steam was escaping from the valves. The engineer whistled. The train started and soon disappeared, mingling its white smoke with the eddies of the densely falling snow. The detective had remained behind. Several hours passed. The weather was dismal and it was very cold. Fix sat motionless on a bench in the station. He might have been thought asleep. Aouda, despite the storm, kept coming out of the waiting room, going to the end of the platform and peering through the tempest of snow, as if to pierce the mist which narrowed the horizon around her, and to hear, if possible, some welcome sound. She heard and saw nothing. Then she would return, chilled through, to issue out again after the lapse of a few moments, but always in vain. Evening came, and the little band had not returned. Where could they be? Had they found the Indians and were having a conflict with them, or were they still wandering amid the mist? The commander of the fort was anxious, though he tried to conceal his apprehensions. As night approached, the snow fell less plentifully, but it came intensely cold. Absolute silence rested on the plains. Neither flight of bird nor passing of beast troubled the perfect calm. Throughout the night, Aouda, full of sad forebodings, her heart stifled with anguish, wandered about on the verge of the plains. Her imagination carried her far off, and showed her innumerable dangers. What she suffered through the long hours, it would be impossible to describe. Fix remained stationary in the same place, but did not sleep. Once a man approached and spoke to him, the detective merely replied by shaking his head. Thus the night passed. At dawn, the half-extinguished disk of the sun rose above the misty horizon, but it was now possible to recognize objects 2 miles off. Phileas Fogg and his squad had gone southward. In the south was all still vacancy. It was then 7 o'clock. The captain, who was really alarmed, did not know what course to take. Should he send another detachment to the rescue of the first? Should he sacrifice more men, with so few chances of saving those already sacrificed? His hesitation did not last long, however. Calling one of his lieutenants, he was on the point of ordering a reconnaissance when gunshots were heard. Was it a signal? The soldiers rushed out of the fort, and a half-mile off they perceived a little band returning in good order. Mr. Fogg was marching at their head, and just behind him were Passepartout and the 2 other travelers rescued from the Sioux. They had met and fought the Indians 10 miles south of Fort Kearney. Shortly before the attachment arrived, Passepartout and his companions had begun to struggle with their captors, 3 of whom the Frenchman had felled with his fists when his master and the soldiers hastened up to their relief. All were welcomed with joyful cries. Phileas Fogg distributed the reward he had promised to the soldiers, while Passepartout, not without reason, muttered to himself, "It must certainly be confessed that I cost my master dear." Fix, without saying a word, looked at Mr. Fogg, and it would have been difficult to analyze the thoughts which struggled within him. As for Aouda, she shook her protector's hand and pressed it in her own, too much moved to speak. Meanwhile, Passepartout was looking about for the train. He thought he should find it there, ready to start for Omaha, and hoped that at the time lost might be regained. The train, cried he. Gone, replied Fix. And when does the next train pass here? Said Phileas Fogg. Not till this evening. Ah, returned the impassible gentleman quietly. End of chapter 30.